There are thresholds in your life that are not marked by doorways or finishing lines. They arrive silently, disguised as ordinary Tuesday nights, disguised as the low hum of a refrigerator and the soft glow of a television screen, painting the walls in shifting shades of blue and gray. You don't realize you've crossed one until you look back and see the person you were standing on the other side, a stranger separated from you now by a single, irreversible moment. For me, that threshold was the space of 3 feet between the armchair where I was sitting and the sofa where Julian was unraveling. It was the space contained within a single, devastating sentence, followed by an action that contradicted it so completely it felt like the world tilting on its axis. He had looked at me, his eyes hollowed out by a grief I was only just beginning to understand, and said the words that should have ended everything. And then, he had reached for me. We had lived together for 3 years, a tenure that felt both impossibly long and tragically short. Our apartment was a geography I knew better than my own hometown, a map of shared habits and silent agreements. The worn spot on the sofa was Julian's. The third coffee mug from the left, the one with the hairline crack near the rim, was mine. We operated on a kind of unspoken rhythm, a domestic choreography learned through years of proximity. I knew the sound of his key in the lock, the specific weight of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, the way he sighed when a piece of code wouldn't compile. He knew I couldn't sleep if there were dishes in the sink, and that I organized my books by color, a fact he found both absurd and endearing. It was a life built in the quiet spaces, a friendship that had become the primary architecture of my world. And for all that time, I had loved him. It was a truth I had packed away like a fragile heirloom, something too precious and too dangerous to ever bring into the light. It lived in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, constant ache I had learned to carry. We met in a sophomore-level photography class, a prerequisite I was taking for my major, and an elective he was taking to escape the rigid logic of his computer science curriculum. I was the quiet observer, the one who lived behind the lens, more comfortable capturing moments than participating in them. Julian was the opposite. He was motion and light, a whirlwind of easy confidence and booming laughter that filled every room he entered. He was terrible at photography. His compositions were chaotic, his exposures were always blown out or hopelessly dark, but he approached the assignments with a kind of joyful abandon that I found mesmerizing. He'd hold up a blurry, overexposed print of a squirrel and declare it a masterpiece of abstract expressionism. I, who spent hours in the darkroom trying to coax the perfect image from a negative, would just shake my head, a smile I couldn't contain pulling at my lips. He was a supernova, and I was a distant planet, content to orbit him, to watch his light and feel his warmth without any hope of ever getting closer. Our friendship solidified over late-night study sessions that devolved into conversations about everything and nothing. We talked about his dreams of building something revolutionary, some piece of software that would change the way people connected. We talked about my dreams of capturing something true, a single photograph that could tell a whole story without a single word. He was the only person who didn't look at my camera like it was a shield. He saw it as an extension of my eye, of my way of seeing the world. He'd pose for me, striking ridiculous, heroic stances in the middle of campus, making me laugh so hard the camera would shake in my hands. I have a whole box of those early photos, black and white prints of a boy on the cusp of manhood, his face alight with a future that seemed boundless and bright. In every single one, he is looking at the camera, but I know now he was looking at me. I just didn't know how to see it then. When we graduated, moving in together felt like the most natural thing in the world. He'd accepted a lucrative job with a tech consultancy that had him traveling 3 weeks out of every month, and I was piecing together a freelance career, shooting weddings and portraits, working on my own projects in the quiet hours. The apartment became our anchor. For him, it was the place he returned to, the calm harbor after the storm of airports and corporate hotels. For me, it was the entire ocean. It was where I worked, where I slept, where I waited. The rhythm of his arrivals and departures became the new seasons of my life. The weeks he was gone were a kind of quiet winter, a time of patient waiting, of keeping the home fires burning. The days he was home were a frantic, brilliant summer, full of his stories, his energy, the sheer, overwhelming presence of him filling the space that had felt so empty. My love for him was a silent, well-behaved thing. It had to be. Julian was, for all intents and purposes, straight. His life was a series of girlfriends, each one a variation on a theme, bright, beautiful, and possessing a kind of uncomplicated cheerfulness that seemed to match his own. I learned their names, listened to stories about their dates, and offered neutral, supportive advice when he asked for it. I was the trusted confidant, the stable, reliable roommate, the best friend. It was a role I played with painstaking precision, a performance that deserved an award for its sheer, soul-crushing authenticity. Each time he brought a new woman home, I would feel a familiar, quiet fracturing inside, a hairline crack spreading across my heart. But I would smile, shake her hand, and then retreat to my room, to the quiet solitude of my darkroom, where I could process the pain along with the film, watching it develop into a familiar shade of gray. His longest relationship was with a woman named Sarah. She was a landscape architect, and for 2 years, she was a fixture in our apartment. She was kind and smart, and she genuinely loved Julian. I think, in his way, he loved her too. He talked about a future with her, about houses and suburbs, and the kind of life that was laid out like a blueprint. During that time, the ache of my own feelings was at its most acute. I felt like a ghost in my own home, watching the life I secretly craved play out in front of me with someone else in my place. I threw myself into my work, taking on any project that would get me out of the apartment, creating a life for myself in the margins of theirs. I was building a fortress around my heart, brick by painful brick, preparing for the day he would tell me he was moving out, moving on. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 1,000 times, practicing the right words of congratulations, perfecting the smile that wouldn't betray the devastation underneath. The end, when it came, was not the slow fade I had expected, but a sudden, violent break. I came home one evening to find Julian sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the shattered remains of a ceramic vase Sarah had given him. He wasn't crying. He was just staring at the pieces, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He told me she had ended it. She felt like he was holding something back, like there was a part of himself he never let her see, a room in his heart that was permanently locked. She said she couldn't spend her life trying to pick a lock that had no key. He recounted her words to me in a flat, hollow monotone, as if he were reading a weather report. And in that moment, all my carefully constructed walls, all my jealousy and quiet resentment, crumbled into dust. All I saw was the person I loved, broken and adrift, and my own pain was a distant, insignificant star. That night was the beginning of the shift. It was the moment the tectonic plates of our friendship began to grind against each other, preparing for a cataclysmic upheaval. He didn't want to be alone. After I helped him clean up the broken vase, he followed me into the kitchen as I made tea, his presence a heavy shadow at my back. He sat at the small table while I worked, not speaking, just watching my hands as I measured out the leaves, poured the water. The silence in the apartment was different now. It was no longer the comfortable, easy silence of two people coexisting. It was a fragile, humming thing, filled with his unspoken pain. When I handed him the mug, his fingers brushed against mine, and the contact was like an electric shock. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it felt charged with a new and terrifying significance. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He started to unravel in slow motion. The confident, buoyant man I knew was replaced by a haunted, restless stranger. He stopped going out. He worked from home, his laptop a permanent fixture on the dining table, but I could tell he wasn't being productive. He'd stare at the screen for hours, the cursor blinking on an empty line of code. He stopped eating regular meals, subsisting on coffee and whatever I put in front of him. But the most significant change was his relationship with sleep. It became his enemy. He'd pace the apartment late at night, the floorboards creaking under his restless feet. I'd find him in the living room at 3 in the morning, bathed in the cold, blue light of the television, watching infomercials with the sound off. He looked like a man lost at sea, desperately scanning the horizon for a lighthouse that wasn't there. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that the ritual began. I found him on the sofa, curled into a tight ball, shivering despite the warmth of the apartment. I sat in the armchair across from him, keeping a silent vigil. After an hour of watching him tremble, I couldn't bear it anymore. I retrieved the thick wool blanket from the back of my closet, the one my grandmother had made, and gently draped it over him. He uncurled slightly, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy and unfocused, lost in some private nightmare. "Stay," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion. It was a plea, not a request. I hesitated for only a moment. The space between us felt like a chasm, a line I had promised myself I would never cross. But seeing him so broken, so utterly undone, was a force stronger than any promise. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my back against the armrest, as far from him as I could manage while still being on the same piece of furniture. He shifted, almost unconsciously, until his head was resting on my thigh. His body was tense at first, a coiled spring of anxiety, but slowly, minute by painful minute, I felt the tension bleed out of him. His breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. And I sat there, rigid and unmoving, until the sun came up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. That night created a new, unspoken language between us. The sofa became a sanctuary, a place where the rules of our friendship were suspended. It didn't happen every night, but it happened often enough to become a pattern, a ritual. He would never ask directly. He would just end up on the sofa, a silent, waiting figure in the dark, and I would understand. I would sit down, and he would gravitate towards me, seeking comfort like a plant seeks the sun. Sometimes he would rest his head in my lap. Other times he would lie stretched out, his feet tucked under my legs. Each time felt like a profound and terrifying transgression. My body would be screaming with the proximity of him, every nerve ending firing. My mind a frantic catalog of sensations. The weight of his head, the scent of his shampoo, the soft whisper of his breath against the fabric of my jeans. I had to consciously slow my own breathing, forcing myself into a state of meditative calm, terrified that any sign of my own turmoil would shatter the fragile peace he had found. I became a student of his grief, an archaeologist of his sorrow. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the tension in his jaw, the depth of the shadows under his eyes. I learned that on the bad nights, he needed the pressure of a hand on his back, a steady, grounding weight to keep the nightmares at bay. On the nights when he was just lonely, he needed to talk, his voice a low murmur in the dark, telling me stories about his childhood, his fears, the gnawing emptiness that Sarah's absence had carved inside him. I listened, offering nothing but my presence, my quiet attention. I was a living vessel for his pain, and I held it for him, hoping that by sharing the burden, I could lighten his load, even if it meant filling my own heart with his sadness. It was a strange, painful kind of intimacy, one that was both more and less than what I truly wanted. It was everything, and it was nothing at all. The plausible deniability of it all was what made it bearable, and what made it torture. We were just roommates. We were just friends. One friend was comforting another through a difficult time. There was nothing more to it. Anyone looking in from the outside would see a simple act of platonic kindness. But they wouldn't feel what I felt. They wouldn't feel the electric current that ran through me when his fingers would unconsciously curl around my knee as he slept. They wouldn't know the way my own heart ached with a desperate, hopeless love when he would sigh in his sleep and press his face deeper into my side. The ambiguity was a blade with two edges. It protected me from the terrifying possibility of rejection, but it also cut me, slowly and deeply, every single night. I was living in a liminal space, a gray area between friendship and something more, and I was terrified that any sudden movement would send me plunging into the abyss. One evening, the ritual escalated. A thunderstorm was raging outside, the kind of violent, elemental storm that shakes the window panes and makes the lights flicker. Julian was more agitated than I had seen him in weeks. He was pacing the living room like a caged animal, his face pale in the flashes of lightning. The sofa, for once, didn't seem to offer enough comfort. He stopped in front of me, his eyes wide and haunted. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and rain. "I can't be alone tonight." I knew what he was asking, and the unspoken request hung in the air between us, heavy and terrifying. My bedroom, my private sanctuary, had always been an inviolable space. It was the one place that was solely mine, the one place his presence hadn't permeated. To let him in felt like the final surrender, the tearing down of my last defense. But the fear in his eyes was so raw, so primal, that I couldn't refuse him. I simply nodded, and the single, small motion felt like a seismic event. He followed me into my room, his shoulders hunched, looking small and lost. My room is Spartan, dominated by a large work table where I mat and frame my prints. My bed is a simple mattress on a low wooden frame, pushed into a corner. He stood in the middle of the room, looking uncertain, as if he had crossed into a foreign country without a passport. I didn't know what to do, what the protocol was for this new, uncharted territory. I just pulled back the covers on one side of the bed and got in, leaving a wide, empty space for him. He hesitated for a long moment, his silhouette framed by the doorway. Then, he moved to the bed and slid under the covers, his body rigid, keeping as much distance between us as the mattress would allow. We lay there in the dark, side by side, not touching, listening to the storm outside and the even louder storm of our own breathing. I lay awake for hours, hyper-aware of his presence beside me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gap of cold sheets. I could hear the frantic, uneven beat of his heart. I focused on a crack in the ceiling, a faint line I could just make out in the ambient city light filtering through my window, and tried to regulate my breathing, to project an aura of calm I was nowhere near feeling. My entire being was a tightly wound coil of yearning and fear. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, to pull him close and tell him everything would be okay. But I was paralyzed by the fear that it would be the one thing that would make everything not okay, the one act that would shatter our fragile, unspoken truce. So I lay there, a statue of self-control, while every cell in my body screamed to touch him. Sometime in the deep of the night, in the quiet space between one thunderclap and the next, he shifted. He rolled onto his side, facing me. I kept my eyes closed, feigning sleep, my own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt him move closer, tentatively, an inch at a time. Then, I felt the hesitant touch of his hand on my arm, his fingers light and uncertain. He didn't say anything. He just rested his hand there, a silent question. I knew this was a precipice. I could pull away, retreat to my side of the bed, and the message would be clear. The boundary would be reestablished. Or I could stay. I could accept this offering, this tentative step across the chasm. I did nothing. I simply lay there, allowing the warmth of his hand to seep into my skin, and my stillness was its own kind of answer. A moment later, he moved again, closing the remaining distance between us, and pressed his face into the space between my shoulder blades. His arms snaked around my waist, pulling me against him. His body was a furnace at my back, and his breath was a warm, steady puff against my neck. And then, for the first time in weeks, he slept. Deeply, and I lay awake, holding my breath, feeling like I was holding the entire world in my arms. This became the new ritual. The sofa was abandoned. On the nights he couldn't sleep, he would appear at my bedroom door, a silent, hopeful specter. The door, which I had once kept closed as a form of self-preservation, was now always left slightly ajar. It was an invitation I offered without words, a signal that the harbor was open. He would slip into my bed, and we would lie there, tangled together in the dark. It was a strange, chaste intimacy. There was nothing overtly romantic about it, and yet it was the most romantic thing I had ever experienced. It was the profound, elemental comfort of another person's presence, the quiet reassurance of their warmth, their scent, the rhythm of their breathing. For him, I think it was a lifeline, an anchor in the storm of his grief. For me, it was a slow, beautiful form of torture. It was giving me a taste of a life I couldn't have, a proximity to a love that wasn't mine to claim. I was living on borrowed intimacy, and I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that eventually the loan would be called in. I photographed him during this time. Not overtly. He was never my subject, but he was always in the frame. I took pictures of the apartment, of the way the morning light hit the empty coffee mug he'd left on the counter. I took a photo of the indentation his head had left on my pillow, a faint, human-shaped shadow on the white cotton. I took a self-portrait where my own eyes looked haunted and tired, but reflected in them. If you looked close enough, you could see the shape of his sleeping form in my bed. My work became suffused with his absence and his presence. It was a series about liminal spaces, about the quiet, aching beauty of the in-between. It was the best work I had ever done, and it was tearing me apart. Months passed. The sharp edges of his grief began to soften. The sleepless nights became less frequent. He started going back to the office, seeing friends, laughing again. The vibrant, confident Julian I first met started to reemerge, like a landscape after a long, hard winter. And with his healing came a new and terrible anxiety for me. I felt the ground shifting under my feet again. The rituals we had built were born of his need, of his brokenness. As he became whole again, I feared that need would disappear, and with it, the strange, fragile intimacy we had found. I felt like a caretaker who was about to be made redundant. The nights he slept soundly in his own bed were a victory for his recovery, but they felt like a profound loss to me. The silence from his room was a confirmation of my deepest fear. I was only a temporary comfort, a port in a storm, and soon he would be ready to set sail again, leaving me behind on the shore. The breaking point, the moment that led to the threshold, came on a Tuesday. It was unremarkable in every way. Julian had been home for a full week, a rare occurrence. He seemed almost back to his old self, his energy and laughter filling the apartment once more. He had spent the evening on the phone with some friends, making plans for a weekend trip. I sat in the armchair, pretending to read a book, but my entire being was attuned to his conversation, to the easy, cheerful tone of his voice. He was rejoining the world. He was moving on, and I was being left behind. The old fortress around my heart, which had been dismantled brick by brick during our nights together, began to hastily reassemble itself. I felt the familiar sting of resignation, the cold cloak of loneliness settling back over my shoulders. After he hung up the phone, he was quiet for a long time, staring at the television without really seeing it. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. I could feel the end of this chapter of our lives approaching, and I wanted to rage against it, to hold on to it with all my strength. But I had no right. I was the friend, the roommate. My role had a clear and defined boundary. He finally turned to look at me, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. It was a look I had never seen before, a mixture of guilt and something else, something I couldn't decipher. "My friends were asking about us," he said, his voice quiet. My heart stopped. I kept my eyes on the page of my book, my knuckles white where I gripped the cover. "Oh," I managed, my own voice sounding distant and thin. "Yeah," he continued, his gaze still fixed on me. "They were wondering why I haven't been going out, why I've been so reclusive. I told them I've just been hanging out here. With you." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, a tight, jerky motion. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and ran a hand through his hair. "It's been great, Leo. You saved me. I don't know what I would have done without you these last few months." The words were meant to be kind, but they felt like a eulogy. He was thanking me for my service. He was closing the account. And then he said the words that shattered everything. He looked away from me, at some fixed point on the opposite wall, as if he couldn't bear to see my reaction. I had to explain it to them, you know? Make sure they didn't get the wrong idea. A cold dread washed over me. "I told them not to worry," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I told them we're just roommates. We're just roommates." The words landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. It was the truth, of course. It was the undeniable, factual basis of our relationship. But after everything we had shared, after all the nights spent tangled in my bed, After all the unspoken confessions made in the dark, the words felt like a betrayal. They were a negation of the fragile, beautiful thing we had built. He was reducing it to a simple matter of logistics, of shared rent and utility bills. He was erasing the intimacy, whitewashing the history, drawing a thick, black line between us. I felt a sudden, sharp anger, followed by a wave of profound, bottomless hurt. My carefully constructed composure crumbled. I couldn't look at him. I just stared at the meaningless words on the page of my book, my vision blurring with tears I refused to shed. The silence that followed was the most excruciating I had ever experienced. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth from the room. I could feel his eyes on me, could feel his regret and confusion radiating across the space between us. I was preparing to stand up, to make some excuse and retreat to my room, to lock the door and finally let myself break. I was going to mourn the end of whatever this had been in private. But before I could move, he spoke again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Leo," he said, and then he was moving. He stood up from the sofa and crossed the 3 feet of floor that separated us. He knelt in front of my armchair, his presence sudden and overwhelming. I still couldn't look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on my lap, on my tightly clenched hands. And then he did the thing that broke the world. He reached out, his hands gentle but firm on my arms, and he pulled. He pulled me out of the chair, out of my fortress of misery, and guided me onto his lap as he sat back on his heels. It was a movement so unexpected, so contrary to the words he had just spoken, that my body went limp with shock. I was suddenly sitting on his thighs, my back pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped around me from behind, holding me in a fierce, desperate embrace. His chin came to rest on my shoulder, his face buried in the crook of my neck. His body was trembling. Or maybe I was. I couldn't tell where he ended and I began. We were a tangled knot of contradiction, of words that pushed away and a body that pulled close. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. That was a stupid thing to say. A cowardly thing. He held me tighter, as if he were afraid I might evaporate. "I don't know what this is, Leo. I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that I can't. I can't go back to how it was before." The confession hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thing. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a declaration. It was just the truth, raw and unvarnished. He was just as lost as I was. We were 2 people navigating a dark, unfamiliar landscape without a map, and all we had was each other. In that moment, sitting there in his lap, held in an embrace that defied all logic and reason, the anger and the hurt began to recede, replaced by a tentative, terrifying flicker of hope. He had said we were just roommates, and then he had made me the very center of his world. The threshold had been crossed, and I had no idea what lay on the other side. The aftermath of that moment was a landscape of quiet confusion. He didn't let me go for a long time. We just stayed there, in the middle of the living room, a strange tableau of apology and acceptance. His arms were a cage, but they were also a sanctuary. When he finally loosened his grip, he didn't move away. He just shifted, guiding me so I was settled more comfortably against him. He never tried to explain the chasm between his words and his actions. It was as if he understood that any attempt at language would only fail, that what had passed between us existed in a realm beyond simple definitions. I didn't push him. I was too afraid that asking for clarity would make the entire, fragile structure collapse. So we entered a new phase of our relationship, one marked by a silent, acknowledged tenderness and a profound, shared uncertainty. The next few days were a study in surreal domesticity. We moved around each other with a new, careful grace. The physical boundary between us, once so rigidly enforced by me and so desperately breached by him, had dissolved entirely. He was constantly touching me, a hand on the small of my back as we passed in the hallway, his leg pressed against mine under the kitchen table as we ate breakfast, his fingers idly tracing patterns on my arm as we watched a movie on the sofa he now shared with me as a matter of course. Each touch was a quiet question, and my acceptance of it was the answer. It was a conversation we were having with our bodies because our voices were not yet brave enough. For my part, I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment he would pull back and declare the experiment a failure. But he never did. He just drew closer. The nights in my bed continued, but their character had changed. They were no longer about his need for comfort from a nightmare. They were about a mutual, unspoken need for proximity. There was an intentionality to it now. He would come to my room when I did, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for us to end our day in the same place. He would curl up against me, his body a familiar warmth, and I would finally, after years of holding back, allow myself to respond. I would let my own arm rest over his waist. I would thread my fingers through his hair. I was terrified every single time. Each small gesture of affection felt like a leap of faith, a step onto a bridge that might not hold my weight. But each time, he would meet me there. He would lean into my touch, sigh in contentment, and the bridge would hold. But the silence couldn't last forever. The unspoken thing between us was growing, filling up all the space in our apartment, in our lives. It needed a name. It needed light and air. I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that I was not the one who could give it that. I had been living with my feelings for so long. They were a part of my own internal architecture. He was the one navigating a new world, the one whose entire self-conception was being challenged. The next step had to be his. And so I waited, caught in a beautiful, agonizing limbo, living moment to moment in a state of quiet, hopeful anxiety. I was a photographer waiting for the light to be just right, knowing that the perfect moment was fleeting and could be missed in the blink of an eye. The moment came, as they always do, when I least expected it. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an infernal glow over everything. I was developing the prints from the series I had been working on for months, the series about him, about us. The images were emerging in the chemical bath, ghosts taking form on paper, the empty space in the bed, the rumpled blanket on the sofa, a close-up of his hand resting on a book. They were quiet, lonely images, but they were filled with a palpable sense of yearning. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't hear him come in. The darkroom was my one truly private space, the one room he had never entered. Leo. His voice was soft, hesitant, and it startled me so much I almost dropped my developing tongs. I turned to see his silhouette in the doorway, framed by the bright light of the hallway. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to scare you." The door was open, it wasn't. The darkroom door was heavy, and I always kept it firmly shut. He must have opened it himself. He had crossed another boundary, quietly and deliberately. "It's okay," I said, my voice hoarse. "What's up?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him and plunging us into the dim, red world I inhabited. He moved to my side, his eyes adjusting to the strange light. He looked at the print floating in the developer tray, an image of the rumpled sheets on my bed, the morning light catching the deep impression where his body had been just hours before. He stared at the photograph for a long time. I could see his throat work as he swallowed. The only sounds were the gentle sloshing of the chemicals and the frantic thumping of my own heart. "Is that what you see?" he asked finally, his voice a low whisper. "When you look at us?" "Emptiness." The question caught me off guard. "No," I said, my voice equally quiet. "That's not it. I see the evidence of something. The space something leaves behind. It's not empty. It's full of presence." He turned his head to look at me, and in the strange, crimson light, his eyes seemed impossibly dark, impossibly deep. He was closer than I had realized. I could feel the warmth of his body, could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. "I don't want to be a space you leave behind," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I want to be the presence." My breath hitched. This was it. This was the moment the light was right. The air in the small room was thick and electric, charged with months of unspoken feelings. He lifted a hand, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a tremor through my entire body. I leaned into his hand, a silent surrender, closing my eyes. "Leo," he whispered, his voice full of a desperate, pleading vulnerability that shattered my heart into a million pieces. Would it be okay? He didn't have to finish the sentence. I knew what he was asking. He was asking for permission to change our world forever. He was offering me the key to the one door I had always believed was permanently locked. And in that moment, under the watchful, ruby glow of the safe light, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the years of patient, hopeless waiting fell away. All that was left was him. All that was left was this. Yes, I breathed. The word was a ghost of a sound, but it was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, closing the final, infinitesimal space between us, and his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or of frantic energy. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was soft and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt and coffee and a sorrow, so deep it felt ancient. It was a kiss that said, I see you. I'm sorry. Please stay. I brought my own hands up, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape of his neck, and kissed him back with all the silent, pent-up love I had held inside me for years. It was a kiss that said, I'm here. I've always been here. I'm not going anywhere. We were just two people, standing in the dark, creating light. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. I could feel the wetness of tears on his cheeks, or maybe they were mine. I'm so scared, he admitted in a ragged whisper. Me too. I confessed, my voice shaking. But the fear was different now. It was no longer the fear of loneliness or rejection. It was the heady, terrifying fear of a new beginning. The fear of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown and beautiful, and knowing you were about to jump. He opened his eyes, and the sincerity I saw in them stole the air from my lungs. I think, he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old confidence. I think I might be falling in love with you, Leo. He said it like a discovery, like a man who had been searching for a hidden treasure his whole life only to find it buried in his own backyard. And I, who had been guarding that treasure for him all along, could only laugh, a sound that was half sob, half pure joy. But the crossing of one threshold only reveals another. The kiss in the darkroom was not an end, but a beginning, and beginnings are often the most fraught and fragile of times. The next morning, I woke up alone. The space beside me in the bed was cold. A familiar, sickening dread pooled in my stomach. I had allowed myself to hope. I had let down my guard, and now the inevitable was happening. He was retreating. He was panicking. I found a note on the kitchen counter, his familiar scrawl looking frantic and uncertain. Had to go into the office. Emergency. Talk later. There was no term of endearment. No mention of the night before. It was the kind of note a roommate would leave. The word hung in my mind, a cruel taunt. Just roommates. He didn't come home that night. Or the next. My calls went to voicemail. My texts were answered with short, non-committal replies. Swamped at work. Sorry. We'll be back soon. He was building a wall between us, brick by digital brick. And I was on the other side, watching my beautiful, nascent hope wither and die. The pain was worse, so much worse, than the years of quiet, unrequited love. That was a dull, chronic ache I had learned to live with. This was a fresh, gaping wound. To be given everything you have ever wanted, only to have it snatched away, was a cruelty I wouldn't have wished on my worst enemy. I felt like a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. His grief, his need for comfort. I had painted it in the colors of my own desire and called it love. Sarah had been right. There was a room inside him that was locked, and for a brief, glorious moment, I had thought he'd given me the key. But he had just been trying the lock, and when it opened, the contents had terrified him so much he'd slammed it shut again and thrown the key away. When he finally came back, a week later, he looked like a ghost. He was pale and exhausted, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He mumbled something about a project deadline and tried to brush past me towards his room. His room. The door that had stood open for months was now his intended destination. The retreat was complete, but I couldn't let him go. I couldn't let this end in the silence of slammed doors and unspoken regrets. I had been silent for too long. Julian, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Don't. Don't you dare walk away from me. He finally looked at me, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it almost buckled my knees. He looked like a man being torn in two. Leo, I can't do this, he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't know how, then let me teach you. I pleaded, my own voice thick with unshed tears. Or we can learn together. But you have to talk to me. After everything, you owe me that. His face crumpled. I know, he said, his voice choked. God, I know. I'm messing everything up. I'm hurting you, and you're the last person in the world I ever wanted to hurt. He finally broke, the carefully constructed dam of his composure shattering. He sank onto the floor, his back against the wall, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. And just like that, my anger evaporated, replaced by the familiar, overwhelming urge to comfort him. I sat down on the floor in front of him, giving him space, and waited for the storm to pass. It was a long time before he could speak. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and raw. I meant it, he said, his voice raspy. Everything I said in the darkroom. I meant it. That's what scares me. He took a deep, shuddering breath. My whole life, Leo, has been a straight line. College, job, girlfriend, house. It was all planned out. I knew who I was supposed to be. And then Sarah left, and the line broke. I was lost. And then you. You weren't on the map. You weren't part of the plan. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of terror and wonder. Being with you, feeling what I feel for you, it's like discovering a new color. It's beautiful, and it's terrifying, because it means the whole world is different than I thought it was. And I don't know how to live in this new world. His confession was a torrent, a flood of all the fear and confusion he had been holding back. He was scared of what people would think, of what his family would say. He was scared that he was just broken and confused, using me as a crutch. He was scared that he would fail at this, that he would fail me. He laid all of his fears out before me, a messy, tangled heap of anxiety. And I listened. I listened to all of it, without interruption, until he had nothing left to say. When he was finished, the apartment was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the quiet after a storm, clean and expectant. Okay, I said softly. He looked at me, surprised. Okay. Yes. Okay. I repeated. You're scared. I'm scared. All of those fears are valid. But they are just fears, Julian. They're not the truth. I shuffled closer, and this time, I was the one who reached for him. I took his hand, my fingers lacing through his. The truth, I said, my gaze holding his, is what happened in the darkroom. The truth is how you feel when you're with me. The truth is that right now, in this moment, we are holding hands in a hallway, and neither of us is pulling away. That's the only map we need. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. He squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement. What if I'm not? What if I can't be what you need? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I gave him a small, sad smile. For years, all I needed was for you to be happy, even if it wasn't with me. That's not going to change, I told him honestly. All I'm asking is that you let me be happy with you. We don't have to name it. We don't have to plan it. We just have to not run away from it. Can you do that? Can you just stay? His eyes searched mine, looking for something. Reassurance. Permission. Forgiveness. I held his gaze, offering him all of it. And slowly, so slowly, he nodded. It was a small movement, but it was a promise. It was a beginning. Again, we didn't magically solve everything in that hallway. The fears didn't vanish. The world didn't suddenly become simple. But we had a new foundation, one built not on unspoken needs and plausible deniability, but on a fragile, terrifying honesty. We started over. We learned to talk, to voice our fears and our hopes. We learned to navigate the new landscape of our relationship, one tentative step at a time. He still had moments of panic, days when he would grow quiet and distant. But now, instead of running, he would talk to me about it. He would let me in. And I learned to be patient, to give him space when he needed it, and to be there to pull him close when he was ready. We were learning a new language together, and while we were often clumsy, we were becoming fluent. The physical intimacy between us blossomed in the light of this new honesty. The touches were no longer questions, but statements. A kiss goodbye in the morning was a promise to return. A hand held across the dinner table was a quiet declaration of belonging. The nights in my bed were no longer about chasing away nightmares, but about the profound, simple joy of sharing a space with the person you love. One night, as we lay tangled together, his head on my chest, his hand idly tracing circles over my heart, he looked up at me. "You know," he said, a small, wry smile playing on his lips, "for just a couple of roommates, we spend a surprising amount of time in the same bed." I laughed, a real, unburdened laugh, and tightened my arm around him. "Just keeping you safe from the monsters," I said. He smiled and pressed a soft kiss to my collarbone. "You know, Leo," he murmured, his voice warm with sleep. "I think you're my favorite monster." A few weeks later, I was hanging the final prints for my exhibition. The series was finished. The last photograph was not one of absence, but of presence. It was a picture I had taken the morning after our conversation in the hallway. It was a close-up of our hands, intertwined, resting on the worn fabric of the sofa. It was a picture of a new map being drawn. Julian came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder, his now familiar way of being with me. We looked at the wall of photographs together, the entire visual record of our strange, painful, beautiful journey. "You did it," he said softly, his voice full of pride. "You told the whole story." I leaned my head back against his. "Not the whole story," I said. "It's still being written." He tightened his embrace, his silent agreement. The story was no longer just mine to tell. It was ours. And so we began to build our new life, not in the gray, liminal spaces of ambiguity, but in the clear, warm light of intention. The architecture of our relationship was redrawn. We were no longer two separate territories with a fragile, negotiated border. We were a shared landscape. His bedroom door remained closed, because he never slept there anymore. My bedroom became our bedroom. The quiet observer and the unknowing initiator had finally found their way to the same room, at the same time, speaking the same language. There is a peace in that kind of arrival that is impossible to describe. It is the feeling of coming home after a long and difficult journey, the quiet satisfaction of finding your place in the world. And sometimes, you discover that your place is not a place at all, but a person. And you build your home there, in the beautiful, honest silence you learn to create together.